Good afternoon. Welcome to UK Column News.
We've had a tricky half an hour, but we're here. Thank goodness.
7 minutes past 1 today, Wednesday, the 16th of December 2020. And we're delighted to have two guests on with us today. We've got Alex Thompson and Vanessa Beeley, but we'll get straight on with the subject being drilled into everybody's minds.
Yes, absolutely. Everybody would be glad to know that a fifth vaccine trial in the UK has begun. This is fantastic news. It started on yesterday. And so this is Valneva. They've started UK clinical trials for its COVID-19 vaccine, currently in development in Scotland. Now they call themselves a specialty vaccine company, and their candidate is going to be tested on 150 volunteers in the UK initially at 4 National Institute for Health Research testing sites, Birmingham, Bristol, Newcastle and Southampton, if they can get anybody to do it. And these early phase 1 trials, they say, will show whether the vaccine produces a safe and effective immune response against COVID-19. So we must be very excited about that.
Well, I'm not excited at all, Mike, as you know, because I'm in the bracket that the government's plans are closing in on me.
Yes. Well, look, that's all we're going to say about that. But let's move on to the issue of vaccines and so-called anti-vaxxers and disinformation, because here's Oliver Dowden. He was in the House of Commons yesterday, and he said, as members across the House know, too many people are still exposed to the worst elements of the web: illegal content, racist and misogynistic abuse, and dangerous disinformation. And of course, the main dangerous disinformation that the government likes to call dangerous disinformation at the moment is with respect to vaccines. So what's this all about? Well, this is because of the pressure that we've been reporting over the last couple of weeks has been building to reinvigorate the online harms legislation that the UK government really has been pushing as hard as they possibly can. Over the last couple of years, they published a white paper last year. They ran a consultation on that. They're now responding to it. So what are they talking about? Criminal prosecutions for social media companies that don't do the right thing. They're talking about massive fines for social media companies that don't do the right thing. They're going to allow Ofcom to demand that tech firms take action against, well, various kinds of content. They, of course, highlight things like child abuse content, which of course the UK government has never done anything about. They claim that they're going to start doing something about it now, but in fact that's the cover for the censorship policy that they're intending to pursue. But it doesn't end with the UK government, because the EU, this is the Deutsche Welle, the German newspaper yesterday, EU unveils landmark law curbing powers of tech giants, and they also are trying to hide what they're doing under what is apparently reasonable reaction. They're mainly looking at antitrust and the sort of monopoly position that the likes of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and YouTube and so on potentially have. But of course, when you actually look at what they're doing here, they're talking about well, first of all, targeting companies over 45 million EU users, but they're talking about platforms becoming more responsible for illegal, disturbing, or misleading content. So maybe we could welcome both our guests on at this point. We'll start with Alex and say this whole idea of disinformation, as you've said already on previous programs, Alex, is predicated on this situation that we don't actually have a definition for the government for what disinformation is.
And I would now like to give it, Mike, because those that we challenged in recent days to come up with such a definition failed to. Dan Hodges, who is accusing parts of the free media of disinformation. So let's actually get the definition from Lieutenant General Ion Mihail Pacepa, the defector from Romania, the head of the Securitate under Ceausescu and the highest ranking Eastern Bloc defector ever, more highly ranking than any Soviet defector. Pacepa defected to the United States in Jimmy Carter's presidency. Actually, he had to persuade Carter to take him in because Carter had recently proclaimed that Ceausescu is a guy we can do business with. And Pacepa wrote 2 books, one called Red Horizons, describing the hideous tortures of Romania that nobody in the Western governments believed in. And the second was called Disinformation, Soviet word dezinformatia. And in it, he goes into the etymology and history of it and says that there is no apparent previous Western backstory for the word, despite claims in France to the contrary. It didn't enter French and English dictionaries till the late 70s. It was a direct borrowing from the Soviet and the Eastern Bloc practice, and it means getting the other side to make your arguments for you. So dressing up your propaganda as though it was the other side's news. Ergo, UK column or whoever is being accused of disinformation is directly being accused by the BBC and the government and others of being mouthpieces for the Kremlin or other foreign governments. Pacepa's other definition of disinformation is that it had to contain nuggets of truth, but that it would never give the readership and listenership primary source information. And by that level of definition, I think UK Column News is at the bottom of the list of those who could be accused of disinformation, whereas Her Majesty's government and the BBC would be near the top of that list for the number of times they provide primary sources, which is never.
Well, thank you for that. So let's bring on someone who, according to the BBC at least, is probably one of the prime sources of Russian disinformation on the planet, and that's Vanessa. And I mean, what are your feelings about this whole policy, the censorship policy, and where it's going? We're going to talk about the BBC in a second, but just in general, first of all.
Well, I mean, I think it's extraordinary, isn't it? We're hurtling towards the abyss where basically if anyone questions any government measures, not only about the vaccines, we're effectively going to be classified as dangerous people. I apologize for the cat passing behind me. And effectively as terrorists. I mean, that's really where we're heading. If we're talking about the final crackdown against any kind of dissent against government measures, and of course the vaccines will be used to bring those kind of measures into force.
Well, indeed. Now let's have a look at one example of this, well, this is from a Facebook group. This is a communication apparently from a BBC journalist called Mariana. Hi, Trevor. I hope that you're well. I'm a reporter at the BBC, and I'm working on an investigation into the different views on a coronavirus vaccine. I want to reflect and cover the upcoming protests this Saturday in opposition to vaccines and lockdowns. I was wondering whether you'd be attending. I think it's really important this growing movement is covered. You're one of the influential people in the movement, so it would be brilliant to have a quick chat if you're around at all. Totally off the record, but just out of interest. Thanks again, Mariana. And Mariana is calling herself on Facebook Mariana Claire. Well, although she identifies her on her Facebook account, as we'll see, just zoom in here a little bit. Although she identifies herself on the Facebook account as being a BBC specialist reporter, she doesn't say anything about what her specialism is. And certainly from that communication, it doesn't seem like she was very interested in explaining what her specialism was. So anyway, Trevor then put out a comment on the Save Our Rights UK Facebook group. A word of warning to our members. Some of you may have received an email from Mariana Claire, a BBC reporter who is looking to chat with people in the movement about their views on vaccines, etc. She is Mariana Spring, BBC disinformation reporter. So that's what he was putting out. And of course, he's absolutely right, because if we look at Mariana Spring's Twitter feed, where she's a bit more open about who she is, it includes this image in the header there in the center. I'm not quite sure why she also has Andrew Neil on there, but anyway, that's whatever she wants to do. So anyway, that image there, which is clearly the same image, or at least from the same section of video as she has on her Facebook page. Now, some people on the Twitter thread were suggesting that, well, she's entitled to get married or to, have another name. But in fact, if you look on her Facebook page, there is an opportunity for her to identify herself as having other names, but she hasn't taken that opportunity. And in fact, if you look at the About section of the Mariana Claire Facebook page, there's basically no additional information about her at all. So about Mariana, no additional details to show. Other names, no other names to show, and so on. If you go through every section, there's absolutely no information about that at all. Now, in the Twitter thread that was highlighting this, Somebody did post the editorial guidelines, including section 6. This is from the BBC on fairness to contributors and consent. And two key quotes from this. We will be open, honest, straightforward and fair in our dealings with sources, contributors, potential contributors and audiences, unless there's a clear public interest in doing otherwise. So they always have a get-out clause for this stuff. So they would probably justify this type of bad behaviour or this type of breach of their own guidelines as being in the public interest. It goes on to say, we would normally seek the informed consent of our contributors, individuals and organisations, and that they should be appropriately informed about the planned nature and context of their contributions before they participate, unless, here's the get-out clause once again, unless there's an editorial justification for proceeding without consent. And one of the things that fascinates me, of course, is that as with respect to editorial decisions, the BBC just will not, for example, answer freedom of information requests. And so you can never really find out what editorial justification they used for a particular decision or otherwise. So, Vanessa, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. It seems to me that this approach is fairly disingenuous because she hasn't identified herself as being the specialist, quotes, disinformation reporter for the BBC. And therefore, that colours perhaps the approach and the nature of the approach and whether that she is trusted by the people that she's approaching.
And I would hasten to say that most people these days have a deep distrust of the BBC. But of course, what this is demonstrating blatantly is that the BBC is now effectively nothing more than an extension of British intelligence agencies. Effectively, what it's doing here is hunting down those that it considers to be anti-vaxxers or vaccine hesitancy individuals in order to target them potentially. And effectively by using, as you say, a method which lulls them into a false sense of security, can this be classified as entrapment?
No, it's very, very interesting that you say an extension of the intelligence agencies. Let's just briefly look into Marianna Spring herself. Here's her LinkedIn profile. Specialist disinformation and social media reporter at BBC News is how she describes herself. And this is the section. She's been doing that job for 1 year, 4 months now. Specialist reporter covering disinformation and social media for BBC News and BBC World Service, working with the BBC with the team at BBC Trending and others across BBC News, provide in-depth reports across a range of media, video, audio and text, breaking original stories and so on. She covers disinformation globally, particularly around elections. But the question is, what age and experience is this lady? Because when we look at her education, she received a Bachelor of Arts in French and Russian, ab initio, and graduated from that in 2018. So this is really her first job then at the BBC. She's at the BBC, she's straight out of university. Alex, I've got two questions here. First of all, what can she possibly know about disinformation on the basis of a French and Russian Bachelor of Arts degree and a 1.5 years experience or 2 years experience at the BBC? And my second question is, would someone who has done a Bachelor of Arts degree in French and Russian at Oxford be a suitable target to be recruited into secret intelligence?
On the latter, yes. As a Cambridge linguist myself, I know the history, and that's even before I joined the intelligence services. To be very frank about us arts and humanities students, even at an Oxbridge level, we have more time on our hand than the scientists do. We have a way with words in our native language as well as the ones we study. We have throughout the 20th century been prime hunting grounds for the intelligence services, as have the very hard-skilled mathematicians and programmers, obviously, and chemists and the like. But yes, she would have been nobbled. Now, as to what you can do with an Oxbridge degree, when you study modern foreign languages, you go to one of the places where one of your chosen foreign languages is spoken for a year, and the other you fit into a semester sometime. So she's been in a Russian-speaking environment, presumably for a year, and in a French-speaking environment for a term, or vice versa, or summer rather, or vice versa. So this would also mean that at some point the Russian intelligence agencies will have got a profile on her. not a clean skin to either side, shall we put it that way?
Yeah, well, somebody has asked in the chat box whether she might have been trained or liaising with 77 Brigade, and I suppose our answer to that has to be, well, that's quite possible, but we don't know, because the British Army's activities at the moment are kept in the dark as far as spying on the British public. Let's delve into the BBC through another doorway. This brings us to Newsbeat and an incredible article. Coronavirus and Christmas, going home not worth the risk. Now, of course, what's significant about Newsbeat is that it's after the minds of young people. And this article seemed to us to be a direct attack on young people. Let's have a look at how it was put together by this journalist, Manish Pandey. So these are some of the quotes that jumped out really. But over the weekend, NHS bosses have warned we must think really carefully about the risks. He's obviously talking about the virus and lockdown. Allowing households to mix has been called a mistake by several health professionals, especially with some parts of the UK seeing record infection rates. And this gem, don't hug your nan at Christmas and then bury her in January. Now, I read this, I don't know what you think about it, Mike, but I found this a particularly offensive sentence from this man. What was in his mind when he wrote it? And to pick up on your point, Alex, in the article, as the public reads it, there is no primary information. This is simply comment by this journalist on what he has apparently read elsewhere. But for the young minds he's targeting, and warning them that if they dare hug their nan at Christmas, they're going to kill her, there's no primary information at all. So I think that this is fake news at the minimum. But what he does is he uses young innocent minds. So this is one girl that focuses in the article, Demi Brown, who's 21. She says, I'm definitely the most lunatic when it comes to Christmas. My family go with it to keep me happy. I'm choosing to stay away from my family this time because of the threat of coronavirus. So I'm going to be cruel here. She's a self-declared lunatic, but she's put forward by the BBC as a role model for other young people of her age. Clearly there's something wrong. I have a lot of older family members and very young family members. It's not worth the risk. I'd rather have my grandmother here next Christmas than me going home this year and giving her the virus. So this is where I think the journalist has picked up from, or did he prompt her with these words? You've no way of knowing, no primary source material. She goes on, my mum's absolutely gutted because I'm the eldest, and out of my two youngest brothers, the youngest cried over the phone, which made me feel awful. I hope to be reunited with my family in the new year if restrictions allow. So what she's saying there is that she's had to tell her family that she can't come home. Her mum's gutted. So there's the family breakdown coming in, Mike, and the BBC just loves it, pumping it out. Christmas has got to be good no matter what. Being sad on Christmas Day isn't going to make you feel any better. Call your family, put a good Christmas film on, some music, and just snack on loads of chocolates and get some wine if you're legal age. So that's key advice from the BBC as to what young people should be doing at Christmas. I'll come back onto that. But let's go to the journalist. Here he is. And this is from back in the 21st of February, where apparently it was EastEnders' 35th anniversary, and he was reporting on his life as a super fan. So you get some confidence in what's in this man's mind. And under the photo is a key headline. It says this: the Queen Vic and barmaid Kat Slater spraying a customer with a fire extinguisher. That is my first memory of watching EastEnders, aged just 5. I'll just cut over to you briefly, Alex. We've got a child of 5 who's now caught into the loop of EastEnders.
For those who have not watched this questionable televisual feast, it started in 1985 and it purports to show life in a mythical, unchanged Cockney community of the kind that American and Commonwealth of people often think London still has. So I'm not making an ethnic jibe here. I'm talking about the way in which life is lived and the sort of cosy life around this East End square. It's all very mythical. I remember that when my parents both had stressful jobs, we were not addicts, but we sort of passively consumed this in the 90s. And then one day we kind of came to our senses. And a few months afterwards, my mother said, apropos of nothing, "Why did I watch that awful propaganda for so many years?" And then she, answered her own question. It's because she was at a low ebb, and the narratives kind of seeped into her slumbering brain at the end of a stressful day and commute. So EastEnders has come in, like a lot of the 1980s conceived soaps, to push very strongly certain agendas, as indeed BBC Media Action has been doing in the Middle East and the former Soviet Union with soaps.
Alex, thank you for that, because that's linked in very nicely with the next part. We did some investigation and we found back in 2005 that Ofcom, of course riddled by the BBC, but nevertheless Ofcom had done a report, A Safe Environment for Children, qualitative and quantitative findings. Now, this is some of the quotes from this document. Opinions about soap operas in relation to soaps. When given a chance to unpick their general feelings of discontent, most respondents wanted to talk about the poor moral standards, the bad behaviour and misery portrayed in some soaps, rather than the explicitness of specific scenes. It goes on. Regular viewers, it said, tended to have a less serious take on the programme content and the effect it could have on young people. Really, that's exactly what I think you've said to us, Alex, is that you watch it, you get drawn into it, and then it's okay because you've got in the habit of watching it. But other people said different things. Sorry, this is the regular viewers also supporting it here, saying that soaps were not watched in the same way as other dramas, as they aren't programs the viewer seriously concentrates on or takes too seriously.
Well, that's even worse then, potentially, isn't it? Because if you're really only sort of concentrating on it, then there's a much more subliminal effect here.
I would agree with that, Mike, and we'll pop this one in, because what the BBC is really achieving here is desensitising the minds of the mothers and the young children to poor moral standards, bad behaviour, and the misery is going in as well. So I'm going to ask the question, is this the BBC facilitating youth delinquency and mental illness?
Yeah.
I'd think there's quite a bit of evidence they are, but let's just go on through. In contrast, teachers and social workers shared many of the perceptions of the general adult sample. They were more concerned about the influence soaps have on young people. So let's bring this in again with the BBC reporter. This is the actual section, and here it says EastEnders was almost always most heavily criticised for interminably miserable characters, depressing plot lines, and then it goes on to say most believe the soap portrayed aggressive and bad behaviour as the norm, and that there was little to like or laugh about. So this is definitely propaganda that's going straight into the mind. The report from Ofcom had this section, which I thought was extremely interesting. They asked people which pre-Watershed TV programmes they found of concern, and then they put some suggestions as to what they might be unhappy about. So we've got celebrities setting a bad example, glamorising of drug taking, glamorising drinking of alcohol, sexually provocative behaviour, bad language, physical violence. And they produced a graph, and their own graph, I think, shows quite nicely that if we look across the spectrum of all those bad attributes, bad language, drug taking, homosexuality is portrayed in there, sexual provocative behaviour, sexual promiscuity, physical violence, antisocial messages, all of the soap operas figure. But of course EastEnders, which is the bright red line, is there peaking quite nicely. So I just wanted to remind people, UK column, we did an article about the BBC's use of soap propaganda in Kazakhstan. This is the article, BBC Media Action Subversion from Broadcasting House to Kazakhstan. And this was the 1995 BBC Marshall Plan of the Mind, which was facilitating soaps in Kazakhstan in order to change the way that the population viewed a capitalist free market economy. Read the article, obviously, for the detail. And a lady who criticised this programme said Crossroads was conceived as an elaboration of a BBC Marshall Plan of the Mind radio soap opera in Russia, based on an Archer's format, and was funded through know-how funds supported by the government's Overseas Development Administration and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So what we've got is propaganda here being used to reframe the minds of societies overseas. The same techniques are now being focused on UK. And if we summarise the what I'm calling poisonous Christmas propaganda, don't hug your nan, stay away from your family, watch TV and eat lots of chocolate, drink alcohol, be fearful of COVID, hope that the experts may allow you some freedom and a normal life next year. And what's clear is no mention of Christ or Christmas. This is just a celebration of Saturnalia by BBC's Manish Pandey. Alex, in 20 seconds, I've got this back to the area that you were commenting on, but the BBC is a master of propaganda, but it's now unleashed that attack on the minds of the UK public.
Well, we've already mentioned Russian speakers. Mariana Spring, if she was paying attention in her Russian curriculum, might remember a classic Brezhnev-era New Year film called Ironia судьбы или с легким паром, or The Irony of Fate in English. We haven't got time to describe the whole plot, but basically it's Christ's taken out of Christmas. The Soviets make New Year the big thing instead. And because everyone goes off on the booze, the joke is that a guy ends up in Leningrad rather than Moscow by mistake, wakes up in someone else's flat, has a fling, and has his family life ruined. And it's all a jolly jape and a magical New Year encounter. And we've got to that stage now in the BBC.
Now, Brian's just been talking about the BBC perhaps promoting bad mental health. Well, I think the furore over Christmas has been designed to achieve exactly that type of issue as well. But the latest news is that the COVID rules are still going to be relaxed over the Christmas period in the UK. But what's absolutely being pushed is this notion that if anybody goes to visit their families, as Brian just says, they will be causing deaths. This is being pushed extremely hard. The fear policy is being pushed extremely hard. It is an unbelievable piece of propaganda, and I believe that what's going to happen in the coming year is that, shall we say that the statistics are going to be cherry-picked after Christmas. People are going to be made to feel extremely guilty because they went and visited their families at Christmas in spite of the advice, and the numbers are going to be presented in such a way that people are going to be left feeling extremely guilty, or at least that's the intention.
It'll be pinned on them, Mike. Elderly people will die, and the government will then turn around and say, oh, that's your fault because you didn't stay locked up in your home. That's the level they're going to take it. So we've got relatives locked up that you cannot get near, and they're going to be killed off with forced vaccinations. That's my prediction as to what's coming. Other elderly people that die, that will be the fault of the younger generation for going near them.
Vanessa, we've been focusing heavily on the BBC here. Now, of course, the BBC is, well, have they actually finished their broadcast of May Day, the series? Is that series finished, or are there still some episodes? But of course, you've featured quite heavily in that. And we have to remember that BBC Media Action that Brian's just been talking about was working in Syria in the years running up to the civil war, and it looked like they were helping even foment that civil war.
Yeah, absolutely. As you've mentioned before, and we've mentioned before on a number of occasions, the BBC was instrumental, as of course it was instrumental in promulgating the weapons of mass destruction narrative that led us to war against Iraq and has led to the devastation of Iraq. Here again in Syria for the last 10 years, and even prior to that, as you've mentioned, the BBC has been pivotal in maintaining the humanitarian war pretext that has enabled our government to fund and sponsor and promote terrorist groups that they are managing inside Syria.
Yeah. Now we're going to move on, but just before we do, Alex, very, very briefly, we have a little bit of video here of Mark Rutte. Now we're going to be talking about Mark Rutte in a couple of minutes with respect to the Middle East and their funding of extremists in the Middle East. But the Netherlands obviously also experiencing lockdown at the moment. Now he gave a little presentation to the nation, I believe it was. Just introduce this for us very, very briefly, if you could.
People won't recognise from the deadpan Dutch delivery, but the ticking off he's giving the nation here is very akin to an old headmaster or army colonel saying, now, when I spoke to you coves about this 3 months ago, I was jolly well hoping I wouldn't have to bring it up again, because people have been naughty because of the Dutch Sinterklaas, which is a bigger thing than Christmas over here. Rates of infection are said to have spiked, and here he is in his turret office, which overlooks a pool in the court buildings in the centre of The Hague, telling the nation why he's closing their shops and schools and disrupting their life again. But people might want to listen to this through headphones, in particular, to listen to the background noise of the beginning of his address.
Yes, because he's speaking Dutch here. We're not interested in what he's saying. You want to be listening to what's going on in the background. So just have a listen to this.
Toen ik bijna 9 maanden geleden voor het eerst een televisietoespraak hield over corona, hoopte ik heel erg dat het ook voor het laatst zou zijn. En daar leek het ook lang op. Maar helaas moet ik mij vandaag opnieuw op deze manier tot u richten. Met opnieuw een ingrijpende boodschap. Minder dan een week geleden zei ik in de persconferentie nog dat we op een tweesprong stonden. Ik zei toen dat...
Look, I think that's brilliant, and I think that the next time Boris Johnson is giving a live stream, there should be a couple of hundred people outside doing the same thing. Alex?
They would have to get themselves outside the security gates on the Whitehall main drag, because until the 1990s, you could actually go right into Downing Street. And it's said that Churchill during the war was particularly pestered by people banging pots and pans, or at least in a more British style, expressing their displeasure. They can't get close enough now. You can maybe do it via horse cars, but that's heavily paraded on. But there's very few ways to puncture the hide of a Mark Rutte, who's always trying to show a Chuckle Brothers face to the world, other than screaming in the background. Now, the Dutch public broadcaster, the equivalent of the BBC, now calls itself NOS, a fairly new name. Perhaps because it was ashamed of its history, I don't know. But it seems that they have edited out, as best they could, the booing from the background of their original live stream of that.
Yes, but to answer the question in the chat box, that was not an added audio track. That was as it was broadcast, and then I edited on a little bit of what was going on outside at the end to show you what was going on outside. Right, look, let's move on quickly. If you like what the UK Column does and you would like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community, and there are options to help us out. That would be very much appreciated. And the Facebook group, Save Our Rights, that was talking about the BBC's interest in their activities earlier on, as we were discussing earlier on in the programme, are holding a Freedom Street party on New Year's Eve in central London. Now, of course, the New Year's Eve party in central London has been cancelled. There will be no fireworks this year. So Save Our Rights are promoting an equivalent event, and perhaps people might like to go to that.
Indeed. And I would just say this one caught our eye this morning, and we're bringing it on screen. We'd like to thank the person for sending it in. We've got a comment which we'll make clear in a moment, but this is suspicions about full fact. Hello UK Column, I've just seen an ad form, a new fact checker on Facebook claiming to check other fact checkers and hold accountable new papers and the government who give out misinformation. They want people to add their name and support them, which seems to be a good thing at first, to get a fact checker holding other fact checkers to account. But when you go to their webpage and click on terms and conditions, you find a lot of information about who and what they are about. I've provided the link at the bottom. They are called full facts. When you start digging into who works for them and how they fact check is where it gets interesting. Of course, when you look at members, there's a connection to the BBC and other outlets like the Guardian newspaper. I will let you look into this. And then the email gives a lot of links, which are all the full fact links. Now, we're going to say straight off, well done for the investigation. Thank you very much for the information. But you are quite right. You've identified full fact. And if you want to see our view on it, you can go back to 2012 article on UK Column faux facts, the disturbing truth about fullfact.org. So don't stop the research. We're just going to gently say we're ahead of you on this one, but we've put that information on screen so that other people can delve into full facts if they're not aware of this. How do we describe it, Mike? How do we describe full fact?
Oh, well, this is one of the trusted organizations that if you want to know the truth, you need to go to, because they're there to make sure that information from anybody else on social media, from alternative media like UK Coleman 21 Wire and Vanessa Beeley, that always gets...
So they're independent, they can be trusted, not.
Indeed,
not.
Yes. Well, look, if we go back a couple of years now, I suppose, there was an information drop, shall we call it. Some files appeared on the internet, allegedly under the banner of Anonymous, and those files were removed from a website from an organization called Integrity Initiative, and this really pulled the lid off some of the so-called counter-disinformation operations of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Now, Anonymous has been busy since then. That particular information was grabbed off a website. It was data that was on the public internet, although it wasn't publicly available. It was on a public website, and so perhaps relatively easy to get. But there have been 2 new drops from Anonymous in the last few weeks and months. This is the most recent one. HMG, Her Majesty's Government Trojan Horse Part 2, infiltrating Lebanon. And that was following this one, HMG Trojan Horse from Integrity Initiative to Covert Ops Around the Globe, Part 1, Taming Syria. Now, we haven't really covered this in any detail so far because, frankly, there's a lot to get our heads around. And perhaps the best person to be talking about this in any case is Vanessa Beeley, because, Vanessa, you understand the organizations, the groups, that have been in the receipt of Foreign Office money. Now, as I say, the Integrity Initiative leak or hack was information from a public website, but in this case, it seems to have come from Foreign and Commonwealth Office internal machines somehow, and Foreign Office does seem to have acknowledged that it's real, but this is really important information, and so just give us a brief overview if you could.
Bit like asking me to do white helmets in 30 seconds.
Yes.
But I will try to keep it extremely brief. So basically, the initial leak of UK Foreign Office documents in relation to Syria exposed an absolutely vast network of outreach agents that were running PR and media support for effectively the armed groups. Now, those include armed groups such as Jaish al-Islam, al-Sham. Many armed groups, of course, had clear ties to Al-Qaeda and to ISIS that we were supposed to be fighting in Syria, of course. Now, among those groups, being funded by the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which, of course, was the same fund that was being used to fund Mayday Rescue, which in turn was siphoning the funds to the White Helmets. That's a very important point to make. But let's just pick on 2 of the organizations. First of all, Analysis, Research and Knowledge, ARC Group. Now, ARC Group employed not only James LeMessurier, who created the White Helmets in 2013 while employed by ARC Group, which was being funded by the UK Foreign Office, his second wife, whose name escapes me right now, but she was also an employee of ARC at the same time as James LeMessurier. Of course, even more interesting perhaps, and of course all of this information, by the way, was completely ignored by the BBC in their groundbreaking, pioneering Mayday series. Somehow they completely overlooked the leak of UK Foreign Office documents. They completely overlooked the Foreign Office funding of PR and media for the armed groups that they were whitewashing alongside the White Helmets. But most importantly of all, they overlooked James LeMessurier's wife, who we believe was the driving force behind the Mayday series program produced by the BBC. they ignored her connection to a company called Incostrat, which she co-founded with Paul Tilley, another former military, probably a former colleague of James Le Mesurier or a former army colleague of James Le Mesurier at some point. Effectively, that means that Emma Winberg, as co-founder of Incostrat, was in receipt of UK Foreign Office funding to whitewash, to provide media support and publicity for groups such as Jaish al-Islam. Jaish al-Islam, alongside Nusra Front, of course, were responsible for the atrocities committed in Adra, to the northwest of Damascus in 2013. One of the atrocities, just one of the many atrocities committed by this group, was the burning alive of workers in a bakery by the putting of these civilians into the actual bakery furnaces. So burning them alive. But people were decapitated. Of course, prisoners were also taken from this attack and were taken to Douma, where they were kept underground in the Tauba jail, where they were systematically for 5 or 6 years tortured, executed, used for slave labor, raped. This is all according to testimony from survivors of those prisons and those attacks, and also from people who lived under Jaish al-Islam occupation in Douma. So all of this connection between Emma Winberg, James Le Mesurier's third wife, and Incostrat, and the media operation run by the UK Foreign Office to effectively criminalize the Syrian government and to iconize the armed groups. Now, I just want to read something very, very, very quickly. This is from one of the documents coming from ARC, just to give an indication to people watching the extent of this operation, because it's very difficult to describe it in a few words. ARC, as a company that has specialized in Syria programming for more than 3 years, has access to a wide range of networks in Syria. We've trained over 1,400 beneficiaries, representing over 210 beneficiary organizations in more than 130 workshops, and dispersed more than 53,000 individual pieces of equipment. This network reaches into all of Syria's 14 governorates, including liberated regime and extremist controlled areas. So they admit that they are extremist controlled areas, and ranges from the most senior Syrian opposition politicians to armed groups. So they admit that they are working directly with armed groups, without, of course, admitting that many of those armed groups were terrorist groups. Now, this is just a snippet from one of the documents in that Foreign Office document leak. Moving on, of course, to the second document leak that you're talking about, which is related to Lebanon. What we see there again is the involvement of ARC. That's why ARC is very important. We see the involvement of ARC in identifying opposition to the government in Beirut or in Lebanon, and inciting that opposition to revolution, basically. And of course, this is what we saw happening towards the end of 2019. And it should be said also that the British Embassy in Lebanon run meetings and training groups in order to enable ARC to carry out these operations. Now, if you remember, I'm sorry for the cat's involvement. If you remember, at the end of 2019, when this unrest was reaching tinderbox levels, Syed Nasrallah actually stepped in, having actually figured out what was going on, and recommended that people stay calm, that they don't respond to these sectarian narratives, to the sectarian fomenting of violence and intersect division.
So there's, I suppose, a couple of questions come to mind, first of all, a point, and that is that over the years, not just the BBC, but other mainstream press as well, have heavily criticised you personally, but also the other people, many of the people that you work with, including Piers Robinson and the Syria propaganda group. But what these leaks do, because these are internal documents, what these leaks do is absolutely validate all the research that you've done. I mean, all the research that you've done has been based on publicly available information, plus also your experience on the ground in Syria.
Yeah.
So this validates everything that you've done in the last 5 or 6 years, 10 years actually, perhaps. So that's the first point. But the thing I think that people should be particularly concerned about is this is UK government taxpayer-funded money going into the hands of terrorist organisations. And as we're going to come on to in a minute, some of those individuals are then being brought back to the UK and other European countries.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if you wanted to cover even the recent asylum given to a former White Helmet leader by Germany. I'm sorry, I'm probably jumping ahead a bit, but this is slightly in connection. I mean, this is recent, and the timing of this is suspicious in that it comes just as the Mayday series reaches its end. And as a number of cases against President Assad are being taken out in Germany, particularly in Koblenz. And we suddenly see a White Helmet leader, or an alleged White Helmet leader, Khaled al-Salah, who actually in 2014 was apparently one of the leaders of the Syrian National Coalition, I think, one of the original so-called moderate opposition groups supported by Hillary Clinton, etc. Effectively, he's suddenly been brought or given asylum in Germany. Now, that asylum was negotiated between King Abdullah and Merkel herself. He was flown in a Luftwaffe plane, and he has now been given full police protection. So one has to question, as previously even the BBC admitted, that he had been investigated. And in fact, there is a division within the German government, I believe it's the Interior Ministry, that is saying they are not happy with the giving of asylum to Khaled al-Salah because of his terrorist connections. Now, of course, this isn't the first time either that a White Helmet has been accused of having terrorist connections. In April 2016, Raed al-Salah, there could be a connection, a family connection between the two, of course. We don't know yet. We are looking into that. And Raed al-Salah, the president of the White Helmets, is now based in Germany. But in 2016, he was turned away from Dulles Airport in America because of his extremist connections. So, you know, it's quite extraordinary that with all the recent spate of terrorist attacks in various countries in Europe, here we have the German government potentially being put under pressure to give asylum to someone that has been accused of terrorist connections, even by Tariq Khoury, a Jordanian MP who stated in Parliament in December 2018 that he believed that all of the remaining White Helmets in Jordan should be extradited to Syria for prosecution for crimes against their own country and for links to terrorist groups.
Yes, now, of course, it's not just the UK government either that's funding, also the Dutch government. And, well, you published an article in RT last week, or this week, the latest evasions and cover-ups by Western governments over their funding of terrorist groups in Syria are starting to unravel. So just give us a little bit of a flavour of this.
Well, I mean, this is the extraordinary case of Mark Rutte that you've mentioned previously in relation to COVID, and it'd be interesting to get Alex's comment on this, that he has effectively personally blocked an investigation into the funding of a leader of a group designated by Dutch courts as a terrorist group, Al-Sham. Now, that funding ran from, I believe it was 2017, and it's continuing until 2021. Labib al-Nahas, who is receiving indirectly the funding being given by the Dutch government to a couple of organizations that are then using Nahas as some kind of consultant and are paying him a handsome sum on a monthly basis. Now, Nahas was it always makes me laugh when he's described as the foreign minister of al-Sham. Now, what is interesting here is Rutte is effectively blocking two investigations. There's one dating from 2018, when it was found that the Dutch government had been funding Jabhat al-Shamia, another designated terrorist or at least extremist Salafist group. And as I've mentioned, the funding of the leader or a former foreign minister of al-Sham. Now, al-Nahas was UK educated. He was educated in Birmingham, and I would refer everyone to the article that I wrote for UK Column about a Birmingham academic, Professor Lucas, who was also based, of course, at Birmingham University. Now, Nahas was Syrian Spanish born, educated in the UK. He had a company in the UK until 2014, when he effectively joined an armed group, Liwa al-Haq, that then merged with al-Sham. Then he became, as I said, foreign minister. He was given access to the Telegraph, to the Guardian, to the Washington Post. He was welcomed into the US. He was welcomed all over the world to promote al-Sham as a moderate opposition alternative to the Syrian government. It has to be said also that the British government has admitted communicating with al-Sham as part of the political process, of course, the externally managed political process. But Thierry Meyssan, a French journalist, has also said that Incostrat, and we go back there to Emma Winberg, the third wife of James Le Mesurier, Incostrat was also responsible for the public relations and media support for al-Sham. Now, al-Sham committed a number of heinous atrocities in Syria, including in 2016, when Nahas was still very much connected to the group. His brother Kenan al-Nahas took over as leader of the group in 2017. I'm very sorry, she's determined to interrupt this broadcast. So Nahas effectively was with the group when they massacred Alawite civilians in Zara in May 2016. But it also should be noted that Nour al-Zinki joined with al-Sham, and of course Nour al-Zinki were responsible for the beheading of Abdullah Isa, a 12-year-old boy, in July 2016. And it must also be remembered that the researcher that the BBC used, and they used him as a witness in the Sean Penn episode of the Mayday series, he is also linked to Nour al-Zinki. So I think we're starting to build up a picture of the nefarious nest of black op operators that are involved in all of these cases that are now strangely all coming to the surface.
And as if we need to highlight once again, British Foreign Office and the British Broadcasting Corporation, both heavily involved in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I wonder whether, Alex, whether you got some comment there. Your name was mentioned.
I do have a couple of loose ends to tie up there. First of all, the production company, I think it was, that Vanessa mentioned, ARC. I'm not sure where they claim to be based, but there were two telltale signs in the English there that the blurb was written by a native speaker of either French or Dutch. And those are specialized in for specializing in, and pieces of equipment for items of equipment. So that may be interesting for Vanessa's further research and other people's. Now, in the Netherlands, just as in Germany, as covered by Vanessa, there has been parliamentary or government coalition opposition to the comforting and the succouring of jihadis. In the Dutch case, it's come from two parties with Christian in the party name. It's been a bridge too far for them to send Toyota trucks on behalf of the Dutch government to jihadis under the false claim that these are only moderate jihadis. In fact, alternative media was onto this as early as May 2019, when they doorstopped Mark Rutte out campaigning for the European parliamentary elections, and said, how are the Toyotas getting on? Have they reached their recipients in Syria? And he said, I have no idea what you're talking about. He's doing the same thing now. What you played out in the background was a clip of Nieuwsuur, which is by RTL, an international European broadcaster. People should look out that tweet and listen to the calm, persistent pressing by the journalist saying, have you personally made calls to your coalition partners, the other parties in the Dutch government, or rather the party leaders who are in your cabinet, over the last couple of weeks, personally pressuring them to put a whip on their parliamentarians not to vote for this? And by the way, whipped party democracy is an issue that we're going into some detail on in our Constitution podcast series at the moment, ukcolumn.news.org/constitution. So you should keep listening to that. We're covering it in more detail in the next episode. And Rutte just uncharacteristically blanks the guy for a couple of minutes and says, confidential, confidential, but also repeats the point, I might have lent on people, but I really can't tell you what my schedule is. I do so many things. I'm always talking to people. So he has not specifically denied that he has been lobbying people in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, sorry.
It's never clear, is it? At the moment we're dealing with these wars overseas. We get a cloud of a dark cloud over UK or other Western nations. We never get the truth about what's really happening on the ground.
Not from them, that's for sure. But Vanessa, let's just end with this section with this. You were on an interview with Kevork Almassian. Was this yesterday or the day before?
It was yesterday, yeah.
And you go into this in much more detail, I believe. But I mean, we haven't even scratched the surface of this yet, and hopefully we'll be covering this in much more detail after the new year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're looking further into it now to see exactly what the reasons might be for suddenly negotiating the asylum of this individual in Germany after he'd basically been left languishing in Jordan since July 2018. So a fair amount of time has passed. I also just want to go very quickly back to the documents, if I can. If you remember, I did an investigation on the ground in Aleppo in 2017, where I unearthed with Khaled Iske, for a Syrian journalist, the documents relating to Integrity Consulting and Adam Smith International, another two organisations, outreach organisations, not actually mentioned, I don't think, in the UK Foreign Office leaks. But as you said, what this effectively means with these leaks is that, yes, my work and the work of many others is vindicated. And of course, that is what the BBC is desperately trying to bury. But not only the BBC, I mean, The Guardian, Channel 4, a number of media outlets. Bellingcat, of course, is on the case. Trying to dismiss everything as Russian disinformation. But, you know, document evidence is document evidence. And that was actually produced by myself at 21st Century Wire in early 2017. And as you rightly say, it's now vindicated.
And we can just end that segment by perhaps saying that we know from a couple of weeks ago that there was a brutal police raid on a Foreign Commonwealth Office official. Their apartment raided early in the morning, a particularly brutal police raid, and the place ripped apart and apparently looking for leaked documents. But at the moment we don't know what those documents were. But we do know that action took place. So it seems that there's some fear growing inside the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Well, are we going to continue for a few minutes?
I think we should, in that we were late starting, but I think Alex has got a couple more sections here, so maybe that's the thing to do.
Okay, Alex, let's come on to this then. Politician, well, you tell us what this is about.
The headline from Humans Are Free is Politician from Curacao blows whistle and says we are being blackmailed to impose draconian laws that severely restrict basic human rights. Circled just above Venezuela on the map is the small Dutch island of Curacao, which is one of the self-governing territories in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. The Netherlands itself is a united kingdom, as Britain is, in that there are several realms with their own self-governing parliaments that only come together for top-level constitutional purposes, but otherwise have their own laws. But in this situation, we find that the most important politician on the island, by some people's calculation, in that he's the leader of the biggest party in parliament, the parliamentary leader of the biggest party in parliament on the island, Steven Walraut, is telling us a rather different story. He says in an interview, which is embedded on that page, I think with subtitles, "I hope the situation in the Netherlands changes, then we can go back out into the fresh air. We're at the end of the food chain, and being a small island, we, that's Curaçao, have no say. We have our backs to the wall. Because just like a French département d'outre-mer, the Dutch Antillean territories are being governed as part of the metropolitan country for many purposes. So they have this ridiculous situation that here it's cold and foggy outside, so the Dutch are saying ideal breeding grounds for bugs. But Curaçao, of course, just off Venezuela, is tropical. And yet they're having the same lockdown measures imposed on them, and they're being told, well, of course you are self-governing, but should you choose not to go ahead with the metropolitan Netherlands measures, you'll miss out on €1 billion worth of infrastructure and tourism development, which of course for an island of less than 200,000 people is economic death. More dissent coming from the Netherlands as well. Here is Els van Veen, a Dutch general practitioner or family doctor. She's giving testimony to the Dutch equivalent of the well-known German Corona-Ausschuss, so an extra parliamentary inquiry to do what MPs failed to do and find out what the ramifications of COVID policy are. The URL's on the right for people to look it up. It's from 9-4 News that covered the YouTube upload by the external inquiry. And Els van Veen says she finds herself being obliged to lie to her patients and breaking her Hippocratic oath. She thinks the Netherlands is sticking too long to the vaccinate everyone narrative. She says, I don't know whether there is malign intent, but this is not democracy. So many issues now come down to your view of democracy, which we're finding out in our broadcasting more and more. Likewise, over in Greece, we find something interesting, perhaps with bearing in mind what we just had in Lebanon, because Greece and Lebanon are regional near neighbours, and they have the same problems, particularly the movement of migrants right now. And the man who's pointing the finger at British and other charities now for paying for people trafficking into Greece and further into Europe is Panayotis Mitaraki, who's not just your bog standard anti-Westerner. This is a very elite centre-right man who's been at the very top of banking, been through all the Western elite organisations, INSEAD Business School in Paris, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and a very highly regarded financier. And he is now saying to the Times that charities, including a British one, form part of a network stretching from Somalia to Britain in which smugglers move refugees illegally. So that's in the Times. Just to wrap up what your question of why there is so much pressure being put on the Foreign and Commonwealth Office people in this, well, there's spookery involved quite plainly. If you go to the expose regarding Lebanon that Mike put on screen a few minutes ago and find that link, these days you can go to the video description a few hours after the YouTube upload and find the relevant link, you will find extensive mention of TGSN, the Global Strategy Network, which is large or effectively headed by a man who's retired from the Foreign Office and MI5 and MI6 counter-terrorism roles called Michael Barrett. Michael Barrett, born 1949. There's several people with that name. And Barrett is up there on this website, and they're listed in the leaks document as co-owners of the risk of whistleblowing or independent journalism, together with the Foreign Office. So that's an open admission that an arm's-length spook outfit is acting as part of the Foreign Office for these purposes. Also mentioned in that piece is a group founded just at the end of the Cold War, 1992, called the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, a transparent equivalent to the CIA setting up of the NED in America, the National Endowment for Democracy. We're finding that always the drum that's being banged is these countries in the Levant must have democratic institutions. This is the West's whole game. Not representation in Parliament, that doesn't count. What they mean is participatory democratic institutions to say, on behalf of all the young people or all the women in the country, we reject the sitting government.
Yeah. Okay, Vanessa, have you got anything to add to that?
Not really. I just hope. I mean, it does appear that there is some kind of insider leak. I know dear old Dominic Raab tried to dismiss it as a Russian cyber attack with the initial Foreign Office leak, but it does appear that there is an insider sharing documents with Anonymous, unless it is a genuine hack. Long may it last.
Well, indeed, but frankly, would find it a little bit incredible to believe that it is a genuine hack, that there is somebody has managed to, Alex, maybe you've got thoughts on this, somebody has managed to get from the outside onto Foreign Office IT infrastructure. I'm not sure that that's likely.
No, FCO IT infrastructure in my day was very well managed. Some Whitehall departments are notoriously sloppy in the way that any large organisation can be if it's not an actual intelligence organisation. But FCO has very tightly managed IT, often the same people and software being used for that as to protect the agencies. I think it's much more akin to Ezra Levant's leak of last week of Canadians having Chinese troops training with them and stealing their winter warfare secrets, because in that case, the cache of documents that was finally released by the Canadian Department for External Affairs, their foreign ministry, instead of having lots of redactions in black, had them very barely greyed out, so that the words that were not meant to be read were perfectly legible. So again, I think very tightly equivalent, because it's the foreign policy bureaucrats in both countries are saying, sod it, we're not going to go along with this anymore, because they can see that they're being choked out by spooks.
Okay, well, what's going on with the media in the United States and their ethics code?
On the right is April D. Ryan, who's been with CNN for a while, and she's a White House correspondent accredited. In fact, the National Association of Black Journalists in the United States made her the Journalist of the Year a couple of years ago. And here she is, having picked up on a tech journalist tweeting out a rather breathtaking recorded conference call by Joe Biden, talking again in rather questionable terms about how all black people ought to vote for him. He wasn't quite saying that, but that was the upshot. It was an address to a bunch of civil rights people. And of course, this made waves in the US black community. So it was retweeted here skeptically or telling offingly by April Ryan from her position of very considerable privilege as a securocrat or journalist for the securocrats in Washington. And she's basically saying this should not have been leaked because the intent was not right. The question is who leaked this and why. Now let's have a look at the feedback that's come to this. This will be very quick to do. Owen Higgins, an independent tech journalist, says, would you consider yourself a reporter at this point, or is that more of a former job description? Let's go on and see what else has happened. This is the most interesting of all, because here we can't have an accusation of internalized white supremacy or whatnot, because it's another black journalist of distinction who's with Motherboard, a tech outfit again, Edward Ongweso Jr., who, with heavy sarcasm mode on, said, it's irresponsible and sets a dangerous precedent for journalists covering the incoming administration to be able to use secretly recorded conversations in their stories. To parse out Biden's thoughts and anticipate his policy commitments, you must go through proper channels. This was retweeted approvingly by a slightly tin-eared April Ryan, who says, you hit the nail in the head. This is not good at all. What else has she been up to since then, actually? We've had a couple more screenshots of what's going on here. Since then, Mr. Ongweso himself, he retweeted this, well, I've just mentioned that, and when she said in her own words agreed, so she made a second endorsement of it. And look at some of the tweets that she has liked. I think these are Ongweso's replies, but anyway, April Ryan of the CNN, the White House correspondent, and someone else of distinction with a blue check liked another searingly ironic reply that said, revealing a contradiction between Biden's private thoughts and public statements is dangerous because it erodes public trust in the president, the office of president, and the media itself. And yet another one that she's liked. The White House press secretary, the spokespeople for the president and vice president, senior officials without attribution, that's a dig, of course, at how White House and security correspondents do their jobs, and the president's public statements are all designated and responsible sources for information about the president's thoughts and intentions. April Ryan liked this as well. Among those who responded with utter incredulity is Glenn Greenwald, who said this was some of the worst stuff he'd ever seen. Again, it somewhat endorses what Brian's been saying through this programme and oftentimes before about the attitude which system journalists in the legacy media have to their jobs now. And in this case, this lady has gone within 3 years from being acclaimed by her own ethnic group as the finest journalist in the nation to this level of parroting.
Yes, incredible.
Thank you for that analysis, Alex. And I suppose we end by saying, and of course we've got the BBC here in UK using exactly those techniques. It only reports what the government wants it to report, and we don't want to do any proper investigative journalism because that might upset the public, certainly upset the government. Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for joining us. Alex, thank you also. Thank you also to our listeners and watchers today. Thank you very much to 77 Brigade. I'm sure you're with us and we look forward to seeing you all on Friday.
We should probably mention that Friday will be the last UK column of 2020. UK column news. It's going to be a bit of a special. A few people, extra people in the studio and online as well. So do join us for that one. We think
there should be some fun, despite what the government would have us all do with Christmas. We think there should certainly still be some fun. So we're looking to do something just a little bit fun on Friday.
Yes.
We'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us. Bye bye.
Bye bye.